The next technique I want to show you is how to use scaffolding stitches instead of pins to build up a new set of stitches to cover a hole. I've got a needle threaded up here with some bright orange cotton thread, and this will be removed at the end, so don't worry too much about what you use, but I would say something nice and bright that you can see would be really good here. As always, I'm going to insert my needle away from the side here and then bring it up into position on that first available loop. I'm then going to pick up 2 loops at the top here, like that, pull those through, and then back at the bottom I'm going to go down through the first loop that I came up through, and then through the next loop next to that as well. So you can see I've basically made one very long V-stitch here with my scaffolding thread. I'm going to repeat that at the top again, and then at the bottom, picking up 2 loops each time and essentially creating a big zigzag stitch. These threads are going to act as an anchor for us to build up our new stitches to cover the hole. And then I'm moving the needle out to the side once I've secured every single loop, and then I can just get rid of that excess thread. I already know that I've got 2 rows of stitches to rebuild here, and you can see that quite clearly. I've got 1 row here and then the second row here. But if you're working with a larger hole, it's definitely worth, before you get started, just going across and counting up all of the rows, maybe even writing that down somewhere so that you can tick them off as you're sewing, just so that you don't get confused and actually end up skipping a row or adding in an extra row of stitches where they're not needed. It's really easily done. To get started, it's going to look very similar to how we worked with the pins, except this time I'm not going to fill in and duplicate these stitches here. So I tend to recommend doing that, as I said with the pins video, even though these loops are structurally sound. I think it's always worth adding them just to really reinforce the area, as long as it's not going to add too much bulk. If you think about an item of clothing that's worn out, chances are it's because it's a high stress area, and when I come to repairing something, personally, I want to make sure that I'm extending these stitches as far as I can to make sure that I've got a really long lasting repair. Having said that, if your loops are completely fine here and they really don't need any extra stitching, then you can start straight away on this first row that we need to rebuild, maybe just extending your stitches out to the side a little further. In my case, I'm going to start 2 stitches over, leaving a tail thread to weave in at the top so I can work my duplicate stitch on these first 2 stitches. And now I'm ready to start recreating the stitches. I'm going into the loop beneath this stitch and then up through the loop where my first orange stitches are. And for the process of this now, we want to just ignore these stitches really. We're using them as a foundation and as a securing method, but we don't want them to get in the way. So I'm now going to go behind them, picking up those 2 threads, wrapping my yarn around them, being careful not to pull too tightly here. And you can see that's now my first half of the V-stitch. And then when I go back down through that loop and up into the next loop, it's here as I pull my yarn through that we need to be really careful not to pull anything too tightly. As you can see, it needs a bit of wiggling to make sure that the tension of the stitch is even in comparison to the ones around it. I'll show you that again. I'm picking up these 2 orange scaffolding threads here, pulling my yarn through, not too tightly, and then back down through that loop and up again. And then as I pull this loop, I'm just being careful not to pull too tightly. A good tip here, as you can see, I'm putting my needle into that loop and then using my other hand just to adjust the tension of the thread until that stitch looks fairly even. So again, just holding my needle there, pulling the stitch around it, and then I can make the last new stitch on this row and then move across to the existing stitches. As you can see, this method is a bit more fiddly than the pin method. I find it a bit more wobbly than using the pins just because it feels very easy to mess up the tension. So what I would say is to work very slowly and adjust each stitch as you go, but know that you can make adjustments at the end as we did before. I'm now moving up, ready to start working back on the second row. So I'm switching directions and hands again. You might have noticed that when I switch directions with my mending, I switch hands rather than switching the work around. I can be fairly ambidextrous when I'm mending, but if you do find it easier, don't forget you can just rotate your work so that you're always using your dominant hand to do the sewing. I'm in position now ready to start that second row, and as with the pin method, I now have my first row of stitches that I can pick up. So as you can see, I'm going down through this stitch here, and then I'm going to go up through the loop on that first row and pull that through. Because this hole was only 2 rows high, I can now go into these 2 loops at the top here, and this will start to close up the hole. As you can see, this is also going to start hiding the orange scaffolding stitches. So I'm going down into the loop of that new stitch that I've made, and then picking up the one next to it, and again going down into the loop at the top, up through the next one, pulling that through, and then finishing that stitch off by going back down through the loop on the first row, moving over and picking up the next loop. Hopefully you can see now we're on the second row, it's not quite as fragile using these scaffolding stitches, and adjusting the tension of the new stitches we're making is a little easier because they're held in place by the stitches around it as well as the stitches on the first row. Whereas on the first row we had nothing but the scaffolding stitches to hold everything in place. I'm just about to close up the last hole here, so down through that loop, and now I'm back up to the existing fabric. I'll add a few more duplicate stitches to the side here, and then I can push that needle and thread through and remove the sponge. You can see now that the hole is closed up and you've got your new set of stitches. And then on the back, we can pull that tail thread through from the front. And you might find it easier to remove those scaffolding stitches from the back as well. So for me, you can't really see them at the front here at the moment. I've got my tail thread here, but I can see more of them on the back. So because we're getting rid of them anyway, you can just use a pair of snips to trim where you need to in order to be able to pull those threads out. Be careful here not to pull too hard on any of the new stitches or get anything caught up. And then once those are removed, that's the technique finished.